The look on my daughter's face when she introduced him told me everything I needed to know, and none of it was good. His name was Colton. She'd met him 8 months earlier at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital where she worked as a pediatric nurse. He was charming in that effortless way that takes years of practice to perfect. Quick with a compliment, quicker with a laugh, always saying just the right thing at just the right moment. My daughter Abigail was 34 years old. She was smart, careful, the kind of woman who read the fine print on everything. I'd raised her that way after her mother passed, just the two of us for 22 years. I trusted her judgment on most things. I did not trust my judgment on Colton. I want to be fair here, because I've gone back over it 100 times trying to figure out if I was just being a difficult old man who couldn't let his daughter go. Maybe I was in some small part, but what I felt the first time I shook his hand wasn't protectiveness, it was recognition. I've been in the construction business for 38 years. I'd built my company, Hale & Sons General Contracting, from a two-man operation out of a second-hand pickup truck into a regional firm with 43 employees and contracts across 4 counties in western North Carolina. In that time, I'd hired men, fired men, partnered with men, and been burned by a few of them. You develop a kind of radar. You learn to read the gap between what a man says and what his eyes are doing while he says it. Colton's eyes were always somewhere else. Not in a distracted way, in a calculating way, like he was running numbers in the background of every conversation. I kept my mouth shut for 6 months. I watched. I asked my daughter careful questions. How did he spend his weekends? What were his friends like? Had she met his family? She had answers for everything, and they all sounded fine on the surface. He was a commercial real estate broker, worked for a firm out of Asheville. He had 2 friends she'd met and liked. His parents were both deceased, no siblings. That last part gave me pause, but I told myself it wasn't a crime to be alone in the world. It was when she told me they were engaged that I made my first mistake. I said, "Abigail, I need you to slow down." She looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something deeply disappointing. Not angry, exactly. More like tired. "Dad, I knew you'd say something like this." "I'm not saying anything. I'm saying slow down. We've been together almost a year." "I know how long you've been together." She set her fork down on the table between us. We were at her kitchen table. She'd made the pot roast I liked. And she said, "What is it about him? Specifically?" "Because I've been waiting for you to say something real for months, and all I ever get is this vague uneasiness." She was right. I didn't have anything specific. I had a feeling. A man who has run a business for 38 years sometimes leads with a feeling, and it has served me well. But to a 34-year-old woman who loves someone, a feeling is not enough. I understood that. I told her I was happy for her, and I meant it, mostly. I just asked her to consider a prenuptial agreement. She agreed to that. Surprised me. When she told Colton, he agreed too. That surprised me more. They set the wedding for the following October. A small thing, 60 people, at a vineyard outside of Brevard that Abigail had always loved. She'd been to a friend's wedding there years before, and told me she'd always imagined getting married under those old oak trees. It was a good venue. I wrote the deposit check myself, told her it was a wedding gift. The prenuptial was drawn up by her attorney, a woman named Patricia Collins who had done good work for our family before. It was straightforward. What was Abigail's before the marriage stayed Abigail's. She had a house, a modest investment account, and a partial ownership stake in Hale & Sons that I'd signed over to her 3 years prior when I started thinking about succession. That stake was worth something. Not a fortune, but something real. Colton signed the agreement in March without any protests that I heard about. I should have found that more suspicious than I did. The summer before the wedding was the best stretch I'd had with my daughter in years. Whatever tension had been between us loosened. She came to Sunday dinners more often. She brought Colton, and I made genuine efforts. I asked him about work, about the properties he was moving, about a development project outside of Hendersonville he mentioned once. He gave smooth answers. They always checked out at the surface level. I just never felt like I was talking to a real person. I felt like I was talking to a performance of a person. One Sunday in July, my business partner of 21 years, a man named Owen, pulled me aside after dinner while the others were on the back porch. Owen had been with me since we were both in our early 40s, when I bought out his smaller operation and brought him on as partner. He knew our books as well as I did. He said, "I want to ask you something and I need you to hear it straight." I said, "Go ahead." "Has Abigail ever talked to Colton about the Cape Fear project?" The Cape Fear project was a commercial development contract we just secured, the largest in our company's history. A mixed-use build on the outskirts of Wilmington, worth about $11 million over 2 years. We hadn't announced it publicly yet. We were still in the final stages of the contractual paperwork. I told Owen no. She wouldn't have. She knew better than to discuss unannounced contracts. He nodded slowly. "Then I need to show you something." He pulled out his phone. He had a screenshot of a listing from a commercial real estate database. A property adjacent to one of our planned supplier warehouses near the Cape Fear site. The listing had gone live 4 days earlier. The listing agent was Colton's brokerage. It was possible it was coincidence. It was possible Colton's firm had been working that area independently. It was possible. I told myself it was possible on the drive home that night, and I almost believed it. I called Patricia Collins the next morning. Patricia had a colleague, a woman named Sheila who did investigative work for law firms, mostly financial and civil matters. Not a private detective in the dramatic sense, but a forensic researcher. She knew how to find paper trails that people thought they'd buried. I gave Sheila 3 weeks and a flat fee I won't disclose. I told her what I wanted to know. Who was Colton really? And was there any connection between his business activities and our Cape Fear contract? She came back to me in 11 days. I remember sitting at my kitchen table when she called, the same table where I'd eaten breakfast alone for 22 years. The window over the sink looked out at the backyard where Abigail used to play as a child. I had my coffee. I was not prepared for what Sheila told me. Colton's full name was Colton Marsh. He'd grown up in Tennessee, studied business at a school in Chattanooga that had since closed. He'd worked for 3 different real estate firms in 7 years across 2 states. He'd been married once before, briefly, to a woman in Georgia. That marriage had ended with a lawsuit that was settled out of court. The woman, I won't say her name here because she deserves her privacy, had alleged that Colton had manipulated her into adding him to the deed of her home, then refinanced the property behind her back. She'd eventually gotten the house back. The settlement was sealed. He'd done this before. Not to someone's daughter, to a woman, her property, her life savings. But that was only half of what Sheila found. The other half was worse. Colton had a silent financial relationship with a development consulting group based in Charlotte. This group had a history of acquiring land adjacent to large commercial projects just before those projects were announced publicly, then selling that land to the primary contractors at a significant markup once the project created demand. It was not technically illegal in every instance, but it walked a very fine line. The property his firm had listed near our Cape Fear site was purchased through an LLC connected to this consulting group 6 weeks before our contract was finalized. Before we had announced anything publicly, the only person outside of our core team who knew about Cape Fear was Abigail. She hadn't told him intentionally, I am certain of that, but Sheila found a series of emails, obtained legally through a civil discovery process attached to an unrelated matter involving the LLC, that showed Colton had asked Abigail specific questions about my business over a period of months. Casual questions. The kind a caring fiancé asks about his future father-in-law. And Abigail, who trusted him completely, had answered them. She hadn't known what he was looking for. She hadn't known she was feeding him anything at all. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after I hung up the phone. I was not angry in the hot way. I was angry in the cold way, the kind that settles into your bones and stays there. My daughter was getting married in 6 weeks. I did not go to Abigail immediately. I want to explain why, because I know that's the part people question. I had the information. Why didn't I just go to her right then? Because I'd made that mistake before. I'd gone to her with a feeling. She'd heard the feeling as interference, as control. as her father not letting her live her life. If I came to her now with documents and allegations and a story about a sealed lawsuit in Georgia, I needed it to be airtight. I needed it to be something she could not explain away or soften in her mind because she loved him. I needed her to see it the way you see something under a bright light, not through the fog of wanting to be loved. So I called Patricia again, and then I called Owen, and then I spent 3 weeks building a case that a person could hold in their hands. Patricia drafted a memo laying out the financial connection between Colton's activity and our Cape Fear contract. She contacted the woman in Georgia through a mutual attorney, carefully, respectfully, and asked if she'd be willing to speak with Abigail directly. She said yes. She'd been waiting for years for someone to ask. Owen went through our internal communications and documented every piece of information about Cape Fear that could have reached Abigail, and therefore Colton, and cross-referenced the timeline with the LLC's property purchase. The gap was 17 days. 17 days between a conversation Abigail told me she'd had with Colton about my business and the date that LLC executed the purchase contract. 2 weeks before the wedding, I asked Abigail to come to my house. I didn't tell her why. I told her I wanted to have dinner. She came on a Thursday evening. I'd made her mother's chicken and dumplings because it was the meal we both loved best, and I knew what I was about to do was going to hurt her, and I wanted at least one thing to be warm. We ate most of the meal before I said anything. She talked about the final fittings for her dress, about the florist changing the color of the centerpieces at the last minute, about being both exhausted and excited in a way she hadn't felt since she was a child on Christmas Eve. She was happy. She was genuinely, visibly happy. I thought about stopping. I thought, she is happy? She is 34 years old, and she finally found someone she wants to build a life with, and you were about to take that from her. Is this worth it? Is your feeling worth it? And then I thought about the woman in Georgia, about what her life looked like after the lawsuit, about what Abigail's life would look like after a few years of marriage, when Colton had learned everything there was to know about Hale & Sons, when his name was on more paperwork, when the prenuptial became harder to enforce. I got up and came back with a manila folder. I sat back down across from my daughter and I said, I need you to read what's in this folder. I need you to read it all the way through before you say anything to me. She looked at the folder, then she looked at me. Then she picked it up. She read for 22 minutes. I watched her face the whole time, and I am not going to describe what I saw there because it is hers and not mine to share. I will only say that when she set the folder down, she didn't look angry at me. She looked like someone who had just been in a car accident and was still deciding if she was hurt. She said very quietly, he asked me about Cape Fear in February. I remember it. He asked what the big project was that you and Owen were always on the phone about. I didn't say anything. I told him it was a commercial build on the coast. I didn't think. She stopped. I didn't even know the name mattered. It wasn't your fault. I know it wasn't my fault. She said it plainly, not defensively. Just a statement of fact. Then she said, I need to talk to the woman in Georgia. Patricia has already arranged it, whenever you're ready. She nodded once. She folded her hands on the table. She looked out the window for a long time. Then she said, I need a few days. I gave her a few days. I won't walk through everything that happened next in detail because some of it is my daughter's story to tell, not mine. What I will say is this. She talked to the woman in Georgia for almost 2 hours. She went back through her own memories with new eyes and found 3 other moments, small moments she hadn't thought twice about at the time, where Colton had asked specific questions about my business, about our contracts, about which counties we were expanding into. She confronted him 10 days before the wedding. I was not there. I had offered to be, and she told me firmly that this was her conversation to have. I respected that. She called me that evening and told me it was done. She'd shown him the documentation. He'd tried, at first, to explain it away. When she didn't accept the explanations, he'd gotten angry. When she stayed calm through the anger, he'd gone quiet. She said there was a moment where she could see him doing the arithmetic in his head. what he still might salvage from this situation, and the moment she saw that look, she said, was the moment she was certain she was making the right decision. The wedding was called off. The venue deposit was recoverable because Abigail had insisted, when she booked it, on a cancellation clause. She'd always read the fine print. I taught her that. There were 60 people who had to be notified. There were gifts to be returned. There was a dress. There were weeks of aftermath that I helped with where I could and stayed out of where she asked me to. The harder thing, the thing that took longer than any of the logistics, was the grief. She had loved him. Whatever he was, whatever he'd been doing, she had genuinely loved the man she thought he was. That loss was real, and it didn't dissolve just because the man turned out to be something other than what he presented. I sat with her through a lot of evenings that fall. We watched old movies, we ate too much takeout. I let her talk when she wanted to talk and didn't push when she didn't. She told me once, somewhere in November, that she was angry at herself for not seeing it. I told her that wasn't fair. I said I'd been looking at him with 63 years of experience reading people in business situations, and I hadn't seen it clearly enough to put it into words until Owen showed me that property listing. That wasn't a failure of her perception. That was a man who had spent years learning to be invisible in exactly the right ways. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "You knew something was wrong from the beginning." "I knew something felt off. That's different." "You were right. I wish I hadn't been." And I meant that. I want to be clear about that. There is no victory in this for me. I didn't get to walk my daughter down the aisle. I didn't get to dance with her at her reception. I got to watch her spend a fall and a winter rebuilding herself from the inside out, which she did with more grace than I could have managed at her age. As for Colton, Patricia's documentation was eventually turned over to the state attorney's office in the context of a broader investigation into the Charlotte Consulting Group that had already been opened by the time our situation came to light. I don't know exactly where that stands as I'm writing this. These things move slowly. What I know is that the Cape Fear project moved forward, that Hale and Sons broke ground in the spring, and that my daughter's ownership stake is intact. There is one more thing. Last spring, a few months after construction on the Cape Fear project began, Abigail came by on a Sunday afternoon. She didn't call ahead, she just showed up at the back door the way she used to when she was in her 20s and needed to think out loud in the presence of someone familiar. She sat down at the kitchen table and she said she'd been offered a position she wanted to talk through. A director of patient services role at a larger hospital system in Charlotte. More responsibility. Better pay. Further from home. We talked about it for 3 hours. She took the job. She's good at it. She drives back to have Sunday dinner when she can, and when she can't, we talk on the phone while I'm doing the dishes. She sounds like herself again. Fully like herself, not the careful, slightly muted version of herself she'd been during the years with Colton, which I hadn't fully noticed until I heard her without it. That's the part I keep coming back to. The part I didn't expect to be the thing that mattered most. I thought I was protecting my business. I thought I was protecting our legacy. And maybe I was in part. But what I was really doing, what I was really fighting for, without knowing how to say it at the time, was the sound of my daughter's laugh with nothing underneath it. I got that back. That's the whole story. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you almost stepped on without looking. There's a version of this where I say nothing, where I swallow the feeling at that first handshake, tell myself I'm being a controlling old man, and walk Abigail down the aisle at that vineyard outside of Brevard on a beautiful October afternoon. I've thought about that version more than I probably should, because in that version I get the dance. I get the photographs. I get to watch my daughter cry happy tears instead of the other kind. But I've lived long enough to know that the comfortable choice and the right choice are almost never the same thing. Colton was counting on the comfortable choice. He'd built his whole life around other people making it. What I keep coming back to is this. Every action in the story had a consequence that arrived exactly as earned. Colton spent years learning to ask the right questions and listen for the answers that served him. That kind of deliberate dishonesty doesn't happen by accident. It's a choice made over and over again, refined until it looks like charm. And the consequences of those choices arrive the same way, slowly, methodically, until one Thursday evening they were sitting in a manila folder on my kitchen table. I didn't manufacture that outcome. I just refused to look away from it. Abigail's integrity through the whole thing humbled me. When I showed her that folder, she didn't collapse, and she didn't rage. She read every page carefully, asked one precise question, and then said she needed to talk to the woman in Georgia herself. That's not a reaction that comes from nowhere. That's what it looks like when someone has spent their whole life building the habit of facing hard things with clear eyes. She'd been doing that since she was 12 years old and her mother got sick. I watched her learn it then, and I saw it fully formed in her the night everything fell apart. The intelligence that protected her wasn't just cleverness, it was the slower, harder kind, the kind that asks questions instead of assuming, that checks the fine print, that doesn't let love make it careless. She'd had that instinct even with Colton. She'd pushed back on the timeline. She'd agreed to the prenuptial without hesitation. Some part of her already knew. She just needed the light turned all the way up. And what she showed afterward, building her life back through that fall and winter, taking the job in Charlotte, coming out on the other side more herself than she'd been in years. That's not something I can take credit for. That came from somewhere inside her that no one put there and no one could have taken away. The hard part of being a parent is accepting that the most important things your children have are the things they grew themselves, in the dark, without you watching. I don't know what happens to Colton. I'd made my peace with not knowing. What I know is that my phone rings on Sunday evenings, and my daughter sounds like the person I raised. And that turns out to be worth more than any contract I've ever signed. Some costs reveal their value slowly. This one I understand now.